Good morning. She Melody Del Marianistia, touching Insle, Ashi Hempash's team. Hashkan Zolti Dasha Chados Hodachini Dashanova. Hello, my name is Melody Delmar, and I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. I use a traditional greeting to respectfully honor any of my relations that may be joining us today. I am the coordinator of the Native American Heritage Program from Missouri Humanities. Thank you for joining us for honoring our ancestors with land acknowledgements as we facilitate simple approaches on how organizations, communities, and anyone interested can learn about land acknowledgements and even work to respectfully weave meaningful land acknowledgements into their structures. Join us for an interactive educational presentation followed by a panel discussion. Missouri Humanities Native American Heritage Program is excited to contribute to the Missouri Bicentennial and is working to highlight the vital role land acknowledgements can bring to the people, places, and ideas that shape our society, which reflects our mission to enrich lives and strengthen communities through reaching Missourians virtually with our programming. Whether you are joining us on Zoom or Facebook Live, I would like for you to interact with us throughout the program. If you're on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching and leave us questions for a Q&A session toward the end of our program. If you're on Zoom, you can either use the chat or just the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the discussion, and we'll address as many questions as we are able. I invite you to learn more about Missouri Humanities by liking us on Facebook or visiting our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. To become a member, visit mohumanities.org. When our program concludes, a link will appear for you to give your feedback, which will only take a few minutes. In a few minutes, your feedback helps us drive what our programming looks like for you. These surveys are so important as we continue to bring public programming to Missourians and work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. We start our presentation with our land acknowledgement. Missouri Humanities respectfully acknowledges that the land on which we reside has cultural significance for many Native peoples, including the Osage, Oto, Missouri, Saucon Fox, Iowa, Kanza, Illini, Kickapoo, Peoria, Shawnee, Delaware, Sioux, Piankashaw, and Cherokee. We are ever mindful that these peoples continue a sacred relationship with the lands we occupy, and we both recognize and appreciate their integral contributions to the land we currently call home. What is a land acknowledgement? I wanted to start with a little history on how we want to engage with this content on land acknowledgements as it relates to cultural history and heritage in Missouri. As I described, starting with our own land acknowledgement, I understand as a newer person living in Missouri, I was unfamiliar with the vast history of Native people who have lived here long before my time. With that knowledge, I realized that there's a lot to learn about honoring our ancestors and relatives who call this land their ancestral home. Today, there are 573 federally recognized tribes in the US. This map here helps represent PAM. We strive to educate Missourians about the rich Native American presence, mainly because a state law in 1839 made it illegal for Indians to reside in our state, a statute that was reinforced as late as 1899 and only repealed in 1909. Missouri became the primary avenue of not only Indian retreat across the Mississippi from eastern woodland tribes escaping bitter warfare and cultural destruction in the 1700s to thousands more forced through the state as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Trail of Tears being one of the most recognized results. In fact, Missouri contains more miles of the Trail of Tears than any other state. There are many other states without a permanent Native community, whether it is a reservation, trust land, state recognized, or federally recognized tribe. Yet, local, state, and national parks across Missouri tell the story of our numerous other tribes who call Missouri home. So when we approach how to develop a land acknowledgement, these are common elements to consider as a starting point to work with, whether it is for yourself, a group, or organization. Each of these areas are very related and important to a respectful understanding of developing a land acknowledgement. So we'll start with relations. Think of this as who you are in relation to everything else you are doing. What is your place? What are your connections? How are your relations impacting your community? Purpose. What is your purpose in developing a land acknowledgement, and why is it important for your relations and communities? How can this be interwoven or reflected in our personal values, mission, vision, and impact? Education. These are very closely related, as all of the points we've made in this circle so far. So how are we engaging with Indigenous communities in stewardship? Are we building relationships? Are you able to learn from the actual tribes if you are able? And also learn how the tribes are thriving today along with their challenges. Learn about whose land you're on, such as the history of the land, the environment, tribes removed, and how to correctly say their names if you're able. Working with music in the American Wild has been a wonderful experience to learn about how other organizations are involved with the Missouri Bicentennial. As our Native American Heritage Program works towards spearheading educational efforts with land acknowledgements, Music in the American Wild celebrates the people, places, and stories that shimmer of new music. Please enjoy our following interview with the incredible work they are doing in Missouri, the Bicentennial, and how land acknowledgements are being used with their programs.
My name is Emlyn Johnson, and I'm the flutist and co-director of the American Wild Ensemble.
I'm Dan Ketter. In American Wild Ensemble, I play the cello, and with Emlyn Johnson, we direct the ensemble. American Wild Ensemble is a musical group that commissions new music to be written on different themes and ideas for local American communities. We started in 2016 with a set of compositions that were celebrating the centennial year of the National Park Service.
What we learned was really special about this project was the connections we were making with our audiences and the communities that were being created around this music in these spaces. So over time, as we have continued to do different kinds of thematic and site-specific, something that's not only about performing in outdoor spaces, but more about these communities that come together. Our mission now is to celebrate and to reflect on and to respond to American people, places, American history, stories, and ideas. And we're really interested in engaging with many different concepts, with different people, different places all throughout the country. We think of our programming as a real extension of our mission. And when we design each of our projects, we try to create a really cohesive design, a really thematic and a theme-focused design. So we tend to start with an idea. Maybe we're celebrating a specific anniversary, maybe we're exploring a specific figure from history. Then when we invite our audiences into these spaces, we have a great story to tell, from the original idea to the people involved to the place it's being presented. And we really hope to bring audiences in from many different angles and perspectives. Maybe some come for the music, maybe some come for the history, maybe some come for the idea or the place itself. And that kind of cohesive design is what's really exciting to us. This year in 2021, we're really excited to be presenting Missouri Music at 200, which is a celebration and reflection the Missouri Bicentennial. We started putting this program together a few years ago when we started connecting with composers who live in Missouri or have really strong ties to the state. We ended up with a fantastic roster of 6 composers. We have Stefan Freund, Barbara Harbach, Marcus Lewis, Mike Murray, Chris Stark, and Ingrid Stolzel. When we approached all of our composers, we were really excited to hear their ideas. We gave them, the general idea that we're reflecting on the bicentennial, that it needs to tie into Missouri history or culture in some way, but they all took their own interpretations. Music, I think, is such an interesting tool for an anniversary like this because we use all the different arts to reflect, to respond. But music being a little bit more abstract than maybe a visual representation of something allows for audiences to make different kinds of connections with the history. It allows people to make spontaneous connections, to tap into their memory. Maybe they hear something that reminds them of a folk tune that they knew when they were young, or that encourages them to think about a historic event or story in a different way, maybe a more cinematic way that brings it to life.
Why use music for a reflection? Music is very good at getting people to come together in the same place and to focus on similar ideas. And this could be for a meditative reflection or for a celebration, but it's a good way to get people to come together and sit still and think about something all at the same time.
As we began to develop our Missouri Music at 200 project, we very quickly realized that we wanted it to be more than just a celebration of the statehood bicentennial. Through working with our composers, we were looking at a lot of different perspectives, musical traditions, different historic events, looking at different times, places, eras. We also, of course, wanted to include the perspectives and the identity of Native people, of the indigenous people who inhabited this land before Missouri became a state, who still inhabit this land today, who are a vital part of our culture.
We were really interested with this project to reach out directly to some Native American populations to try to learn more about their specific experience and what was important to them when we're trying to represent something about the history of the state of Missouri. And we're very much looking forward to including land acknowledgement language in our program so that we can speak to a more representative history of the state of Missouri and that experience that this has been for many different people within the state.
When we talk about incorporating a land acknowledgement statement into our programs, we're usually thinking about making a statement at the beginning of an event that acknowledges the land where the event is taking place and acknowledges the people, the tribes who have historically lived in these spaces, stewarded this land, and who continue to live and steward this land today. It provides an opportunity to not only acknowledge people who have come before us, to pay respect to people who have come before us, to pay respect to people who are with us today and to Native people in the future. But it also provides an opportunity to reflect on past injustices. It provides a context for people to learn more about the history and the present. Our first conversations around this topic were with Kelly Thompson at the Booter Center at Washington University in St. Louis, and with Melody Delmar at the Native American Heritage Program at Missouri Humanities. Speaking with Melody Delmar at Missouri Humanities, she shared with us that the Humanities Council is pushing this year to encourage more organizations to incorporate land acknowledgements into their programming, into their events, into their mission statements, and different materials. This seemed like a great start for us with our Missouri Music at 200 project. We learned about different kind of examples and templates, and then we began to craft our own language that would give context to our own project, that would recognize the people who were on this land before us, who continue to be on this land. We are thrilled to share this in a way that provides context to our project, provides meaning to us as performers and creators of this particular event, and we hope provides meaning to our audiences and provides opportunities for them to learn more, for all of us to learn more.
I hope you enjoyed that. And finally, we'd like to go over a few of the elements we have about crafting a land acknowledgement. There are a few different resources that I'll offer at the end of the presentation for learning more. However, for crafting a land acknowledgement, I believe it best fit our organization's history and continued partnership with the Catherine M. Booter Center for American Indian Studies to help give some understanding to Missouri's Native American history timeline, and a tool that helps us understand along with our wonderful guide that is specific to Missouri. We also have a strong partnership and relationship with the Osage Nation Historic Preservation Office. Their acknowledgement is recommended for third-party presentations and events. Our land acknowledgement was developed with our historic archaeologist and executive director to reflect our connections and role to honoring, respecting, and acknowledging Native history in Missouri. So I'd like to invite Emlyn to share your video, and I'll do the same.
Hello.
Hi, Emlyn, welcome, and I'll let you introduce yourself to everyone.
Thank you so much, Melody. I really appreciate the invite to be here today. My name is Emlyn Johnson. As you saw in the video, my husband, Dan Ketter, and I co-direct American Wild Ensemble, and we are working this year on a Missouri Music at 200 project that reflects on the Missouri Bicentennial, and we are really grateful for the learning opportunity and just the chance to work with Melody and Missouri Humanities as we're continuing to develop our programming.
Great, thank you, Emlyn. And it was so great to work with you and learn about your process. Emlyn and I had talked maybe a little over a month ago about how land acknowledgements can be incorporated to their program. And there's so many programs involved also in the Missouri Bicentennial. And as we discussed, Missouri Humanities Native American Heritage Program is really spearheading a way to help Missourians just become more knowledgeable about Native American history in Missouri. And one way we can do that effectively is to start out with land acknowledgements. So we're excited to contribute to our history in that way. So Emlyn, given the experience in the interview, and I also want to shout out the Catherine M. Booter Center, who has been also integral in helping us with these efforts. And they had actually referred Emlyn to us. So we're excited to work with both organizations, and they're a strong partner with us. I also wanted to quickly remind everyone, if you have questions, we're getting close to our Q&A session. So if any questions or thoughts, please enter them into our Q&A. And sometimes we're not able to answer everyone's questions, but I wanted to make sure you got them in there in case you had some for us. And we're also going to be inviting our other panelists on shortly. So Emlyn, did you have any thoughts about the process or the presentation?
Sure. You know, I am fairly new to Missouri. I moved here a few years ago, and didn't know a lot about the history of the state, of the region in general. And so over this time, it's been a real learning experience for me. Some of the things that you mentioned about, removal acts passed in the 1800s and obviously the injustice and violent removal of peoples from this land, how that has really shaped our states and our region's history, was information that I think I had a general sense of, but, became much more alive when I moved here and began to live here. And thinking about this bicentennial project, at first we were thinking about the celebration of the Missouri Bicentennial. And then we were thinking what's really more important is looking at a more comprehensive view of the history of this place, of the history of the land, of the people who have been here at different times, thinking of it more as a more comprehensive history and bringing in a lot of different voices, different perspectives. That's been really important to us with this particular project. And so thinking about this process, we were trying to figure out how are we going to pull in all these different pieces of history, elements of different cultures, traditions, time periods, and reaching out to you, Melody, with the Native American Heritage Program, reaching out to Kelly at the Buder Center, really gave me a springboard to do that. And I feel like the land acknowledgement language is one step for our ensemble and project, and just that, it's one step. There are many other things we can do, topics we can engage with, people we can engage with. But this process has been really interesting to me in terms of, from many different perspectives, but even the research involved. First, looking at a lot of different language that's crafted, doing my own research to try and understand who the people were in all the different places we're performing, what kind of language we want to use specifically for this project. And what we kind of landed on was we wanted to give the context of this bicentennial and give a little bit of context and background as to what this land acknowledgement means for this specific program, how we're thinking about the history of the region, how we're thinking about the people who continue to live here. And so I think that was a real learning piece of the process, was to take a lot of different information and then think about what it really meant to our programs and our audiences.
Okay, great, thanks. So I was curious, are there any changes you were thinking of making to the land acknowledgement, or any ideas you had versus maybe a live event or maybe a webinar? Would that change for you, or what were you thinking?
Sure. I think, in virtual events, just as Missouri Humanities has been doing, since we're thinking more about a statewide audience or a larger regional audience, I think something that we will certainly be doing with our language for virtual presentations is acknowledging a greater number of tribes to represent a larger area, a greater number of nations. And in our live events, which are taking place in Springfield, where I am based, in St. Louis, Kansas City, Columbia, and Joplin, I think it's important to not only recognize the broader, number of nations that have been in these places, but to focus specifically on those ancestral lands. So whether we're talking about specifically Osage ancestral lands, or Oto or Missouri, or wherever we are in the state, focusing on those places, on those specific peoples. And I think also with the live events and virtual, I would say, thinking about crafting our language around, again, just thinking about this kind of broader historic perspective, rather than saying we're here to celebrate statehood. We're trying to include perspectives and look at the broader history of this place. We're still crafting our language, but it has taken, we have looked at the Osage Nation resources through the Missouri Humanities resources, Buder Center resources, further resources through my own research. And so we've taken little bits and pieces from different places, but really thought about how we want our audiences to reflect, what we want them to take from that, what we're encouraging them to do for further learning as well.
Right, and I love that you talked about the statewide programming, because we did have one question specific to your organization. Someone had asked, do you do statewide programs?
Yes, we do. And So for this bicentennial project, we will be traveling around the state for about 5 different outdoor events, and then doing some virtual events as well. In the past and in the future, a lot of the programming we have done has been around national parks and other outdoor spaces. And this experience working on land acknowledgement language for our, directed towards our Missouri project, has also very much influenced the programming that we will continue to do moving forward with national parks, which we all know that much national park land is indigenous land. And so I think it's very important, obviously, to recognize any space that we're in. We know that many organizations around the country and world have a history of incorporating this into their programming. And for others of us, it feels like a new conversation. So, this specific learning experience, I think, is also really going to be very impactful in our broader programming.
Right, thank you. Next I'd like to invite Melissa Horner, our other panelist. She is a current student at Mizzou, right? PhD student, candidate. I'll let you introduce yourself, Melissa.
Sounds great. Thanks, Melody. Tanshi Kakiao, Mizami, Imuitin Anakshkatan, Melissa Horner Dishinakashin. Hello, everyone. It's good to meet you. My name is Melissa Horner. I'm Métis and Anishinaabe. My relatives and homelands are in what's currently known as Southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba, as well as the Turtle Mountains in North Dakota. And so I am a relatively new visitor and guest in this region as well. And as Melody mentioned, I am a PhD student in sociology at the University of Missouri in Columbia.
Thanks, Melissa. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on on land acknowledgements? Because I know we've talked about it before in other programming. So is there anything you'd like to add to, land acknowledgements?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking. There's 2 concrete things I would add. One is just pointing out, to sort of contextualize it even larger, that acknowledging land and place and fellow humans and non-human relatives are ancient ways of relating practiced by lots of Indigenous folks. And so the types of formal land acknowledgements that we're talking about now is sort of like a newer iteration and understanding that people are starting to do. Places like New Zealand and Canada have been practicing this for a little longer than the United States has. But I just wanted to sort of couch that in this broader context, that being aware of where you are and who you're in relationship with is not something that's new, even though this is sort of a new and ever evolving way of acknowledging places and people and lands and animals. And then the second piece that I would just add is, and I imagine we'll get into this a little bit more as we continue through the Q&A, but one really important part of a land acknowledgement is extending the formal land acknowledgement into action. And that is always rooted in building relationships with Native folks who also have relationships with the lands that you're acknowledging in a formal statement. So like I said, hopefully we'll get to touch on that piece a little bit more as we go on, but those are kind of my initial offerings.
Thanks, Melissa. I think you cut out a little bit, but I think you said that you had more to expand on. So I have a question about how we will use, or if our information will be available to use in events statewide. Yes, we're hoping for, as we continue with educating, simply educating Missourians about Native history, that this language offers, the starting of a dialogue of, whose land we're on. And that can continue to other elements that we talked about in the that circle we had there with action, or interpretation and understanding the different policies and laws that were put in place that contributed to Indian removal. But not only that, is that recognizing, which Melissa touched on is that Native people are still here. We're living and breathing and contributing in incredible ways across society. And I think that's what our Native American Heritage Program really has spearheaded, is the ways that Native people are really moving and shaking across the nation. And I would invite you to, if you're curious about learning more about the education piece about connecting to Native people, is to, we'll leave information at the end and also an email, but to learn about it, there are other resources. And I had a question there across the state from some organizations we partner with. One organization, to answer that question, or a couple of them I want to touch on, is we work closely with the Booter Center for American Indian Studies. They have a number of resources, as long as their own incredible timeline about the history of Native people in Missouri, and also some tools and resources on land acknowledgements. They've been a great and longstanding partner with us, along with, we are also a founding member of the Alliance for Native Programs and Initiatives. This coalition is made up of several institutions statewide in Missouri, such as the Missouri History Museum, the St. Louis Zoo, the Missouri Art Museum, and Catherine and Booter Center. And we also work together to look at the state and locally as to how we can further educate and provide programming and spearhead these efforts across the state. And so a lot of these programs also work with the Missouri Bicentennial to highlight Native American heritage. And also we've been starting to branch out more to working with other organizations like your organization, Missouri Universities. What is the program? Sorry, Alliance for People. I'm sorry, I forgot the name.
The Four Directions Indigenous Peoples and Allies. Yes. We've been able to partner with them for a few events this past year, which was exciting. And also I want to mention the Kansas Indian Center, and keep in mind, we're still growing as a program and we're still branching out. So given our capacity and resources, and also the pandemic, we're able to continue to grow and help Missourians learn about their Native American cultural heritage. So let me look at any more questions. Okay, so I have a question for y'all. How can we make land acknowledgements more meaningful than just checking a box or virtue signaling? How can we craft acknowledgements to help Native communities? I can sort of start off on this one. This is such an important question. And one of the things I'm thinking about, I think about land acknowledgements a lot in the context of higher education, just since I'm a PhD student. And so I think about universities a lot, because universities are also entities that are trying to, develop land acknowledgement practices. And so I'll just sort of give an example, or maybe a couple examples to make this a little bit more concrete. So if a university has a land acknowledgement sign on their campus or their website, or say they offer one at events that they're hosting on their campus or their virtual spaces, one thing that I think about in terms of that university creating a more meaningful set of land acknowledgement practices would mean that in addition to their formal land acknowledgement, they would also be doing things like actively seeking out, hiring and retaining Native faculty. They also might be offering scholarships or in-state tuition or free tuition for Native students whose ancestors are indigenous to the land that the campus exists on. They might also figure out ways to give professional development support to colleges and departments, so they can include meaningful indigenous perspectives, guest speakers, history of settler colonialism, things like that. And sort of a top tier one that the universities that are doing this really well do is that they actively develop partnerships with neighboring tribal nations, particularly nations who have relationships with the land that their university sits on. So those are just a couple of things. Some of those are specific, of course, to universities, but some of those things could be transferred to other organizations as well, in terms of thinking like what else could be done besides the formal acknowledgement itself.
I will say this is still a real area of learning and opportunity for growth for my ensemble. And so I really appreciate Melissa's comments. And as I said with our group, you know, this is one piece of what we're trying to bring and what we're trying to offer. And, you know, I think as an individual and with my ensemble, listening is the first step, trying to understand, trying to learn, trying to educate myself and both listen and do my own research so that I understand I'm not relying on someone to spoon feed me all the information that I'm hoping is going to help me do better also. And, you know, something else, of course, is giving to Indigenous causes, supporting Indigenous causes financially, personally, anything that we can do. And I appreciate Melissa's comments and agree that it's all about relationship building and continuing to improve.
Right. And I also wanted to reiterate with having meaningful land acknowledgements, and that part of that is the action piece. I know we have a few questions here is, you know, with any relationship, with relationship buildings, we take action in getting to know people or getting to know who they are, or, you know, with, you know, our elders are people who in our communities who are very, maybe we respect, we get to know them, we support them. And I would say that mindset is just the same thing, you know, get to know the land you're on. And if you don't know, you can, you know, reach out to these Native institutions to start, you know, acknowledging, you know, I'm trying, at least I want to understand. And there's also this piece that, you know, a lot of Native people are often the weight of teaching non-Native people, you know, has been put on us given our histories and of removal and everything. So just to keep in mind that it's, you know, my job in particular to help people understand Native histories in Missouri, but just recognize that some tribal communities have their own cultural and historic preservation programs. I know the Osage Nation has their own program and website that you can get familiar with. And Missouri Humanities, I just want to say a part of the action piece we do is we've long before I got here, we've worked a lot with the Cherokee Trail of Tears Association and also the Osage cultural preservation in terms of ensuring NAGPRA, which is the Native Graves and Repatriation Act, I think. I forgot the exact name, but we work with this pretty much ensuring that any kind of burial sites that are found are respectfully, you know, acknowledged and taken care of, and also that the tribal communities are ensured that they are, you know, represented in terms of how things are handled with the archaeologists and everything. So we take measures to make sure these relationships are in place, and that can be a difficult, you know, challenge to work with. That's the way that we work with, you know, ensuring that the lands that are ancestrally theirs is treated with respect, and you know, that tribal members are notified and everything. So I'll go with another question that also relates. I'm just now seeing another question about are the State Department of Natural Resources Preservation. Okay, I'll read this. Are the State Department of Natural Resources and Department of Conservation incorporating land acknowledgement into the preservation and presentation of formerly Indigenous lands that they manage and interpret to the public? Are they doing so in line with the Bicentennial? This is actually, you know, why we're doing this. I don't have, tabs on all these departments right now, but we're hoping that our efforts with the land acknowledgement can really branch out to these departments. We actually have been working with the state parks and working on how we can actually work with signage and events around the state and opening up these conversations to even larger discussions of how we can offer more resources to Native communities in these places. And, this starts, like I said, going back to building relationships in education efforts. So we're hoping we can continue to build during this year of the Missouri Bicentennial through educational efforts such as this, so they can branch out to all these organizations across the state. Okay, so do you have any tips or experience to share for graduate students? I know someone had mentioned earlier schools, also to bring land acknowledgements to their own schools and programs of study.
Yeah, this is a really good question too. Prior to starting my PhD in sociology a couple of years ago, I was a high school English teacher. So I've thought about land acknowledgements in the context of schools and education, at least to some extent too. And one thing that I always found really valuable was, this isn't necessarily at the school level, but it could be related to it, is bringing your students into the process of developing land acknowledgements and learning the history of the place that they're in. And that can be a really valuable learning tool to learn as a community, like a school community. And when I was teaching still, I found a lot of success and just connectivity in developing curriculum as well, that relates to land acknowledgement. Like, those things aren't necessarily separate for me. That's all about how do we learn about who we're in relationship with and to, and how might, I taught in Montana. So there are a lot of tribal nations in Montana. And so my students and I would learn about how are we related to the tribal nation neighboring us. The closest tribal nation was the Absolique or Crow folks, where I taught in Montana. And one really interesting piece of curriculum that I developed and worked with my students on was how do Crow folks, maybe not every single Crow person, but how do Crow folks understand the land that we're existing on versus what might settler understandings of land might be. And so those were really fun conversations and to have in the classroom with students, and stuff like that from curriculum could develop into a land acknowledgement that would be meaningful for that specific place, that you would absolutely have to have conversations with Native folks who also have relationships with that land too, in order for it to be meaningful and more comprehensive, and maybe less one-sided. So that's sort of one slice of it. There are many ways to approach this, but that's one route, I think.
Right, and thank you so much. And Emlyn, I'm wondering if you can expand on, I know we have a few questions of, organizations outside of statewide organizations such as churches or small groups. I know that your group is more specific to music, and which I love, and also as a growing experience. I'm glad that this is another big reason why we loved to partner with you, is because this is a growing experience. It's okay to make mistakes and learn. And I'm wondering, as a smaller organization, it's just you and Daniel, right? Okay. What are your thoughts on reaching out to smaller groups that are not statewide?
Well, I think my immediate reaction to that is going back to asking yourself, why am I making this statement? Why am I, and as Melissa mentioned, we're talking about more of a formal statement. Why would I be making this at an event? Why would I be putting this in my programming? And so I think for every organization, that may be a different answer. You know, it may be about specific relationships you have in that community. It may be about specific work that you're doing. It may be that you want to encourage your participants, your audience, your community to learn, to think more about their surroundings. There are many different reasons. And I think that, I mean, that translates into the meaningful piece of it, that it's not just being done to check a box, that it's one piece of broader education, of broader action. And so I think it all comes back to that question of just thinking about what is the reflection you're looking for with this. And I think, I don't mean to reiterate myself, but, you know, when I got into this, in this learning process, and I'm still learning, the immediate thing to do was to just start looking up other language that is being used by other organizations. And that's great. That's a part of the research, but it's a really important next step to say, how does this relate to what I'm doing? How does this relate to what we're doing? What is the effect of this? What is the impact that we're looking for? And how are we bringing other people into this conversation? That's a general answer, I know, but that's been kind of my approach to this.
Right, thank you so much. We have so many questions, and we're getting close to the hour, so I apologize if we're not able to answer everything. So I also wanted to invite you, if you have any questions, we're right when we conclude, or when I close down this session, a link will pop up for you to take a very quick survey for your thoughts. And you can also leave some comments if you're interested in learning more, and we'll try and, answer them. But I see a lot of questions related to resources for groups and how to address the many different Native communities, or even pin down who has been in the area. So I know, Emlyn, you just ended with talking about how you started the process, but Melissa, do you have any suggestions on how people can understand or start to look at who to contact in terms of tribal communities or other resources?
Yeah, this is a great question, and sort of similar to what Emlyn said, there unfortunately isn't a super easy answer where we can be like, oh, you have to type this into Google and then go to that link. I wish it were that easy, but it is not, unfortunately, mostly just due to there's no like primary digital repository for everything. But like Melody has mentioned, and like Emlyn has mentioned, I too have found most success in, at the very basic level, at least just looking up tribal nations like websites. Basically, nearly every tribal nation has a website. And if you don't know what the tribal nations are, another good place to, again, just type into Google is like Native Americans in Missouri. And there are people who have land acknowledgements now. There are people who have places that are starting to list tribes. So that can at least be like a very sort of entry level starting point, and then go to the websites of tribal nations. And many nations have histories on there. They have cultural components like language on there, and all of that will sort of start to make your educative process a little bit more robust, and start to plug in understandings of, okay, this is the place I am, and now this is how, say, Osage folks understand this place, or this is Chickasaw folks' relationship or history with this area that I'm in now. One thing that I do think is worth pointing out as well that makes this just more complicated is our sort of idea of modern maps. So say the border of Missouri, that is constructed by settler colonialism, which is a whole other thing that we don't have time to go into today. But that sort of makes, that sort of makes all of us think that like tribal nations and communities will have a relationship like inside these particular boundaries of a state or a city. And that's not how Indigenous communities understand land. The vast majority of Indigenous communities, historically, certainly, and somewhat contemporarily as well, understand land is much more fluid and without these like lines and borders. So if you're looking for I want to know who has a relationship inside this border. That's information that you will never find. So you can just stop looking for that. I'll just save you a lot of time. Because what you will find is there's a lot of overlapping Native communities who have relationships with like this swath of land, and then this swath of land, and then they moved over here, and then over there, and then they lived here for a while, and then settler colonialism moved them there, and then they had to move back. And so it's complicated to find information because the history of settler colonialism and the oppression of Native peoples is complicated. So you just have to sort of embrace that as you're searching for information, and just know that it's complicated because the history is complicated.
Right. Thank you, Melissa. And I have another question that I think we all end on, just because we have a lot to get through. So I apologize we weren't able to get through everyone's questions. I was just looking for anything we'd answer in terms of, we have a bunch of related questions. So I'm trying to see if we can get as many answered as possible. So we have one person asking us, and thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering what the panel's thoughts are on the inclusion of land acknowledgements in published materials that may be distributed outside their place of origin, such as books, websites, podcasts, etc. I can start with a simple inclusion of land acknowledgements. I know a very simple way that I've seen is is as simple as people's emails, or even on Zoom, I've seen people put it on their names. Like, this is, Melody, and I'm on Osage land, or something short like that. I've also seen people put it in their email signatures. I respectfully acknowledge I'm on Osage land. And also, like I said in our, and we kind of quickly reviewed and simply reviewed that, think of your audiences and who you're trying to reach. If you have more time, you could include more people. Like, we have worked with an archaeologist who has worked with several communities on a more of a historical level to acknowledge some. However, we also mentioned that we also recognize the many people who have passed through the land. So I know that can also be complicated to pin down because of colonization. We don't know specifically, when or how, or since time immemorial. So I wanted to offer that as well. And also, okay, so I'll let you'll answer that question if you'd like.
I'm sorry, Melody, I forgot what the question was.
I'm sorry, I was going to go over it again. Okay. So the person is asking how they can include land acknowledgements in published materials or outside, I guess, their place of origin, such as books, websites, podcasts, that sort of thing. So I just kind of mentioned maybe, email signatures, or as simple as Zoom, that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are definitely great suggestions. A couple of things that I would add is, one, this relates to something Emlyn said a while ago that I really appreciated. Anytime you're wanting to include a land acknowledgement on, in a book or an article or a podcast, things of this nature, a great question to always ask yourself is, why do I want to include this? And you can include it for whatever reason you want, but what I have found is land acknowledgements typically are more meaningful the more intentional you are about it. So rather than just being like, oh, I feel like I should do this, so I'm just going to include it, stop, take a minute, and just be like, why is this meaningful for me? And then you'll be able to craft an even more meaningful one. And then the second thing I would say is, including a material like that, I always appreciate it, because if I can situate someone in and on land and where they are and how they're recognizing they're in relationship to place and other people, it helps me understand that person better, even if I don't know them, even if I'm just listening to a podcast or reading a book. And so that's just sort of another way to think about the intentionality and purpose behind recognizing that you are in relationship to place and other people.
Do you have any ideas or thoughts, Emlyn?
I think Melissa said some great points, and I really appreciate the perspective and the insight. And I love what you said about just kind of back to that relationship piece, that you understand someone better when you know where they're coming from. It gives you a different piece of their identity, or how they choose to identify, and the history and current context also.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to honor everyone's time here. And again, if you have any more questions, please be on the lookout for the email tomorrow, as well as the link for the website information to take a quick survey after this. I want to thank Emlyn Johnson and American Music in the American Wild again. I think I keep calling it American Wild, I'm sorry. Music in the American Wild, thank you so much. I very much enjoyed working with you. And also Melissa Horner, it's always a honor working with you, for your thoughtful answers, and I respect your passion for working with communities too. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.